Yeah, Oprah's a weird one for me too. We all kind of have warm, fuzzy feelings about Oprah. She seems like a very authentic person, but then you look at like what she got pulled into. I don't know when she got pulled into it, somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you had also the unleashing of the H1N1 bird flu, a pandemic unleashed at the same time, 2009.
Right. While they're bailing out the big banks and not bailing out the small neighborhood banks that actually gave back to the community, they like, I think 1,000 community banks, like Rob had one, were too small to save. But that was really, I think, the first consolidation of the one world currency that they're heading towards, or what they'd like.
Yeah, and for those smaller commercial banks that did want to get a bailout of some sort, they had to agree to a whole new operating mandate that involved a new set of rules that enmeshed them ever more into this derivatives trading complex of speculative insanity. They had to now play the game. If they had been cleaner banks that had been trying to do good, like, what's that Jimmy Stewart movie from that
It's
we
a
all
Wonderful
watched on
Life.
Christmas? Yeah, it really was. And I mean, I think that, again, everything was culminating. They could have sparked the hyperinflation at the moment. I mean, back in 2008, when the thing started tanking, we had at that point, and this is where I said at the very beginning. So this will sort of tie into what was laid out at the very beginning.
Right.
Germany, 1923. What had happened was to pay these unpayable debt repayments that were demanded by the Versailles Conference on reparations. They had to do something. They had to pay unheard of, impossible amounts of cash to the victor nations of World War I. The problem was they couldn't produce anything to justify the increased money printing, because one of the other spoils of World War I was that the Ruhr region, all of the mining, the coal that was located in the Ruhr Valley was all taken over by France. You had the majority of the rail lines taken control of by the victor nations. They took control of the vast majority of industry and the productive aspect of the real economy, leaving Germany with very little except debt and money printing. So that was their only solution. Now, there is actually another solution that Hjalmar Schacht, a member of Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi's Pan-Europa, Hjalmar Schacht, who was the German Reichsminister, the Nazi finance minister. He was a member of that. He was in opposition to what I'm about to say. There were people like Walter Rathenau, who was the foreign minister, who was a brilliant man, an admirer of Abraham Lincoln of Germany. And he had a plan with certain like-minded thinkers at the time who were in Russia to do what was known as the Rapallo Accord of 1922, that he organized for Russia to erase any debt obligations that Germany had to Russia, and instead work together to build industry and infrastructure together. And Rathenau, again, who was a brilliant guy, his personal assistant was a fellow named Kurt von Schleicher. Kurt von Schleicher survives. Walter Rathenau is murdered by an anarchist assassination operation known as the Organization Consul, which it becomes, after they kill 300 German statesmen between 1920 and 1923, including Rathenau, it sabotaged the Rapallo Accord that would have avoided hyperinflation. If that had been not sabotaged, Germany feasibly could have avoided fascism, it could have avoided hyperinflation, which was a design blowout of the German economy, with the knowledge that Hjalmar Schacht had working for Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, who was his trainer. The idea was that they needed to blow out the existing economy tied to the national constitution in order to then introduce a new type of currency that Hjalmar Schacht oversaw with the Bank of England called the Rentenmark, so that people would bring in their wheelbarrows full of trillions of dollars of useless Reichsmark that could barely buy a loaf of bread, and then trade it in for these new Rentenmarks overseen by Hjalmar Schacht, which would then be tied to a new set of rules of behavior for the state and for the people if they wanted those new Rentenmarks. Yeah, it's like, what do you want? You want to keep people underpopulated, fighting each other, as culturally decadent and stupid as possible.
Dependent on the government.
Dependent on a higher authority outside of their influence, like a feudal lord or, you know, some corporate thing that runs the things you rent.
Right, exactly.
Today. It's always the same. It's feudalism. And so it takes on different forms, but it's always the same thing. And in the case of, I think, Germany in the 20s, it's a perfect display of how that worked. But I think the important lesson as a historian, what I advise people to do, since I know what's inside of us, we tend to resonate with what we research outside of us. And when we're in a state of despair, low-level depression, anger, we find the dark things pretty well. So we were able to find all of the nefarious activity that we can resonate to and discover pretty quickly. But we don't see the drama of the contrast so much, of like, where did the points of light, the moral leadership emerge at different moments to subvert the oligarchy's designs at different moments that they tried to clamp down and really lay down the hammer of feudalism at different moments, like the New World Order of 1919 to 1923. Why did that one world government of eugenics fail back then?
Right.
Is an important positive lesson for us, because it involves us looking at what did Warren Harding do, what did Walter Rathenau do, what did Sun Yat-sen, the president, Christian first president of China, what was he doing in the 20s as well, coordinating all together to subvert, to create bilateral agreements amongst nation states that didn't give over their authority to this League of Nations, Bank of England body.
Right.
And then we appreciate their sacrifice so much more, because all of those three men that I just mentioned all died. And I didn't say this about the organization Consul, that was the anarchist terrorist group that killed many German leaders.
Right.
They were illegalized after Rathenau was killed by the German state finally, but they didn't go away. They were just rebranded, and all of the leading members became the paramilitary group of the SS, of the new Nazi party, that emerged as this Tavistockian psych case named Adolf Hitler, who was in Tavistock in 1911, 1912 with Rudolf Hess, getting like proto-MK Ultra or God knows what, even before World War I even happened. They were already getting induced in England, and there's a painting, for people who may not believe me, of a self-portrait of that Hitler did as a watercolorist, a young man in his 20s in England, sitting on a very specific bridge just outside of Tavistock, which is still standing, and brick for brick, this thing is actually, you know what, I'll send it to you, this article that my friend Uwe put together, and you could maybe make it a link in the description box for people who don't believe what I'm saying. It's so crazy that you have to see it with your own eyes. Wow. But this is what this dude who was induced to take on a messianic eugenics Nietzschean complex, and was instilled with a burning passion to create a new humanity, basically. It's sort of the activation in the right-hand path of what Madame Blavatsky had put forth. Yeah, and the reason why they're pushing this UN 2.0 is because they don't like certain things that they haven't yet been able to remove from the UN Charter, which was created and amongst those things that they despise, that it's troublesome for them, which were not problematic with the League of Nations Covenant, which is different, but is the sacredness of nation states. So after World War I, embedded in the UN Charter, according to the wishes of people like Franklin Roosevelt, who had just died 2 weeks earlier before the San Francisco summit took place in 45 and established the United Nations. He died 2 weeks earlier. And after that, as soon as he died, Harry Truman, the British operatives within the State Department all took control. Truman was an Anglophile. He was basically getting advice on what to do from Winston Churchill. And people like Count Coudenhove Kalergi, who couldn't get a meeting with Franklin Roosevelt when he came to the United States in 1943 and stayed there for a couple of years. Wow. He couldn't get a meeting. He was brought in by the Council on Foreign Relations. And all of a sudden, he writes this in his biography, that as soon as Roosevelt dies, he all of a sudden has full access to Truman and full access to the corridors of power. And he's even the one who's brought in to oversee the Marshall Plan, Count Coudenhove-Kalergi is
I see.
overseeing the Marshall Plan.
The creation of the first regional state, ward, because didn't the Marshall Plan, a lot of the money that disappeared there went into the EU? I mean, to creating it, to creating the environment that allowed the EU to even come to be.
Yes. And, people like Richard Bissell, who becomes the director of the Office of Policy Coordination and Plans, which is the Assassination Bureau and PSYOPs operation of the CIA. He at the time is one of the key agents overseeing also the Marshall Plan funding and black budget operations through the Marshall Plan that creates, as you just said, the EU,
right,
which Churchill is also overseeing as one of the founding fathers of the EU to get rid of nation states and move it to this supranational body as a gateway towards world government. But, and again, he's also overseeing, and he writes about this too, the introduction of a Trojan horse into the UN Charter, which he doesn't like the fact that it respects sovereign nation states as sacred in the first and second articles. He doesn't like the fact that it legalizes wars of power projection onto a smaller country. It illegalizes these things. That's also re-amplified by the Nuremberg codes. But what he does with his power at the San Francisco conference, Coudenhove-Kalergi still, and my wife actually goes through this in great detail in The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set, chapter 2. He introduces Article 52 to 56 of the UN Charter, which permits for the creation of regional blocs.
Right.
And that's the key Trojan horse that allows then the creation of the European Union as a regional bloc. It allows for legally the creation of NATO, because they don't like the fact that nations like China, Russia, India have a seat on the UN Security Council. They're very powerful nations, huge gravitational centers, but the fact that they have a right to veto what the new Anglo-American Axis is trying to do to reconstitute a world Roman Empire, they have to get around it. They can't get their wars they can't overthrow governments in Egypt or in Iran like they do with Mossadegh if the UN Security Council is determining whether a war happens or not. So they have to get around it. How do they get around it? They create NATO. And NATO was created largely as an outgrowth of a plan put forth by a Rhodes Scholar named Escott Reed, who puts out this whole design. And again, these Oxford Rhodes Scholars, they're everywhere. They're Walter, and I mentioned William Yandell Elliott is the guy who trains Henry Kissinger. Well, here's another example of how this works. And here, let's just add a few more names, okay? So you mentioned a few. Bruce Reed, one of the key handlers of Biden since the 90s, who co-authored Obama's omnibus crime bill. That became the Patriot Act. That became, as John Ashcroft said, word for word, his Patriot Act was modeled exactly on what Bruce Reed, Rhodes Scholar, who's still there as political operative, did with Biden in 1995 in response to the World Trade Center and Oklahoma City bombings, both inside jobs, by the way, run by the FBI.
Not a doubt in my mind.
Yeah, and books have been written proving that.
Right.
Other ones example that are active today, Jake Sullivan, right, the National Security Advisor, is a Rhodes Scholar. Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State under Biden today, Rhodes Scholar. You mentioned Susan Rice. She just stepped out after doing 15 or 25 years of damage.
Yeah,
Elizabeth Randall, Homeland Security Advisor,
right,
Rhodes Scholar. Right. Eric Lander, who was the head of CRISPR and the Human Genome Project.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Biden's science czar for a period.
A big Epstein. He was a big Epstein beneficiary.
Guy, Rhodes Scholar.
Right.
Antonio Delgado, Lieutenant Governor of New York, Rhodes Scholar. Mahmoud Mahmudov, who was a COVID response coordinator. Right. Yeah, we shouldn't call somebody out as being necessarily a bad person because of a bad thing that they were affiliated with. I don't agree with that method of thinking, because there's always exceptions to the rule, right? And yeah, you could find good people who were operating through Freemasonic lodges, but they were still good people. They were simply being politically pragmatic. They weren't selling their soul to the devil. Right. And the same thing, you could find good people who have been, Donald Trump spoke at the Davos Forum, Putin spoke at the Davos Forum. It doesn't make just being at the forum doesn't make you a bad person. It means that if you want to be a businessman making deals or a political statesman with influence, you sometimes have to use things that already exist that you didn't create, that might have been bad, but that carry influence that you might want to nudge in a way that is beneficial to you and the people that you care about. That's just a part of like real politics.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that being said, Chris Christopherson was a Rhodes Scholar. I don't think he was evil. I think he probably got sick of that type of lifestyle that he was expected to like devote himself to, and he wanted to be a creative person, and you know, he made some good music and some bad music, but whatever. No, exactly. And you know what? I'll just actually throw one thing that I just found interesting. I get the emails from Kesh Patel every so often, and here's an example of just how good patriots sometimes get misguided by not being aware of this Rhodes Scholarship, British foreign interest thing. Keep in mind, Kissinger was also Sir Henry Kissinger.
I know.
He was knighted as a Knight of the Order of St. George and St. Michael in 1993. George H.W. Bush was Sir, knighted by the Queen to the Order of St. Michael and St. George in 1995 for services rendered to the British Empire's interests. That's why it exists as an order. These are
and
not.
You brought up they still have events for the pilgrims and also for the Privy Council in D.C. So, where they talk about
And they still
and also, wasn't it you who told me Kissinger said that he spoke to the leaders in the UK more than the leaders in America? I remember Kissinger said something like that once as well. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. He in a May 10th, 1981 Chatham House speech in London, he gave a presentation going through it's a worthwhile presentation, and I actually have it as an appendix, the whole thing in
right. I knew I
books.
heard it from you. Yeah, right.
Volume 2 of The Clash of the Two Americas in the appendix. He describes the opposing paradigms of what the post-war world was going to look like, contrasting that of Franklin Roosevelt versus the paradigm of Winston Churchill. And he goes through at great length in a very, very accurate way how the two men had completely clashing views. One was very much opposed to power projection, colonialism, exploiting the poor, and the other one was the British Empire. Right. And he actually says in London, first, that he very much prefers the Winston Churchill worldview over that of Franklin Roosevelt, which is, in my view, absolutely treasonous. And number two, he then says in that same speech that during his time as Secretary of State, that he spent more time keeping the British Foreign Office informed over that of the American State Department.
State Department, right?
And he said the level of integration of British and American policy was unprecedented under him. And he said it was symptomatic. So it's a great speech as far as it being disgusting, but also revealing. And the whole trilateral thing that he brought online led with George Bush as the CIA director for a period before being installed under Reagan as the VP.
And Brzezinski also was involved in that trilateral and that all too.
Well, yeah, both of those men.
Right.
Yeah, Brzezinski and Kissinger were both trained under William Yandell Elliott, Rhodes Scholar. They both interfaced. They were both brought into things through many think tanks in America. They were brought in by Lawrence Rockefeller, who oversaw the Rockefeller Brothers Fund that had created what was known as the Rockefeller Commission of 1956 to oversee the USA's transformation into an empire. It was called, and it basically called for the US needing to embrace what Henry Luce, the head of Time magazine, had already called the American century. The idea of reactivating the Teddy Roosevelt corollary interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine as something that would be based upon a new Anglo-American integration in the post-war age of the U.S. Power projecting its values onto the world as the hegemon with British supervision, of course. And this was done in an official document that's still classified to this day.
Get out of here. This is so crazy. That's a big Henry problem Kissinger, we need to change. Wow.
Yeah, Henry Kissinger, Henry Luce, Lawrence Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller were all overseeing this Rockefeller Commission for the U.S. in 1956. Its content was 4 years later, in 1960, they publish a highly redacted, sanitized summary of their findings. But even now, you cannot read the classified report that became official American policy over John F. Kennedy's dead body. Yeah, I mean, it's a direct tip of the hat to Henry Luce's 1941 Project for an American Century.
Right.
Absolutely. And I mean, at the time, when Luce was doing that, the U.S. under Roosevelt still had an anti-Coudenhove-Kalergi, an anti-world government, anti-eugenics orientation. A lot of the patriots from both sides were working together, fighting to internationalize the New Deal as the basis of an end to global colonialism and the creation of full-spectrum industrial economies around the world. So the success that the U.S. had by FDR's combat against J.P. Morgan, against the Wall Street banks, against the City of London banks that had tried to create the 1933 London Economic and Finance Forum on a world government, which they wanted to do as the solution to the Great Depression that they themselves orchestrated, like they did for the hyperinflation of Germany.
Right.
They did, and that failed in 23 to 25. They tried again a second time for a League of Nations, Bank of England controlled world government under the newly created Bank of International Settlements, created in 1930 as the central bank of central banks, centered in Basel, but run by the Bank of England, by the Montague Norman factions. This is the thing that facilitated the growth of the Nazi war machine, was this Bank of International Settlements. It also had a high level of representation by the J.P. Morgan power structures that were also funding, through Henry Luce's Time magazine and Fortune magazine and Life magazine, fascism in America as the economic solution to the United States' problems of Great Depression. They were still doing that. They were the ones backing and financing this Smedley Butler attempted fascist coup against Roosevelt. They were the ones who were utilizing the anarchist terrorist Giuseppe Zangara, the Italian Freemasonic anarchist who was deployed in 1933 February to shoot and murder Franklin Roosevelt, which ended up killing Mayor Cermak of Chicago standing next to Franklin Roosevelt when a woman in the audience saw this guy's gun and hit the gun. Thank God the woman had the courage to hit the gun, but sad for Mayor Cermak, who did die. That being said, this guy didn't just appear out of thin air. He was part of this same complex of pro-fascist, pro-eugenics, pro-Nazis that were trying to also keep America out of the war, to give Hitler the space he needed to basically win and defeat, destroy Russia, and consolidate power under this fascist high command of the first of several regional blocs that were supposed to govern fascistically the New World Order, with the idea that Russia would become the slave colony of the Germans. That would be their Lebensraum, with the Slavic Untermenschen, that would be the subhumans extracted for slave labor, those who were permitted to live in work camps. And Britain, the Anglo-American fascists of New York and England, would then be granted a jurisdiction over the Americas. England would control its own zones. Like Hitler wanted to give England. There's an interview that's gone viral that people probably have watched by now.
Tucker's
with Tucker
interview?
Carlson yeah, the Tucker interview with Daryl Cooper.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. A lot of people defend it because it says things that are outside of the acceptable narratives of the history. That might be laudable, but knowing what I know and what I think Daryl Cooper probably also, I'd be surprised if he doesn't know. I think it's a bunch of Delphic trash that was being given there that deflects people from the real causation of World War I, of what was motivating Churchill, of a lot of things. And one of those things is that he was maintaining the idea that the world would have been better had Churchill and the British simply agreed to the many, many peace offerings by Hitler, who had already defeated all of Europe and had won the war by 1940. His contention is that it would have been better if the US and England had simply stayed neutral and allowed Hitler to defeat Russia, and all of a sudden somehow peace would have happened. As if that's all Hitler wanted, as if that's all that it was. And the reality is, it's so much more than that. Yeah, and it's like there's more that one could easily discover if you go into it without too many deeply held axiomatic assumptions into your analysis, but you could, by looking at the straight evidence of things, with this appreciation for the contour of this oligarchical global penetration to restore global feudalism, utilizing certain things like fascism. you could sort of appreciate where things were being set up to land back then. And it wasn't just the expansionism of the Nazi, which is, by the way, a cult. And anybody who's trying to analyze Nazism but ignoring the occult, New Templar, SS, Thule Society, inner satanic religious order that was like doing sacrifices in Wewelsburg Castle under the Black Sun, which is like, this is not secret information. Anybody can see and
right.
know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's either incompetent or willfully misinformation. So there's that aspect, which, and I mean, we already alluded to the Luciferian takeover of the UN, Lucifer Trust.
Right, exactly.
That became Lucius Trust, that still runs the invocation centers and invocation prayers.
It still has a meditation room at the UN, even after it's all been exposed.
Yeah, and they do seminars
I have a whole website.
Yeah. No, it's messed up. And this is what technocrats from Brussels, from Washington, and New York, they go and they get seminars from channelers, channeling spirits from the beyond to guide them since the fifth in the United Nations themselves. So you got this whole theosophical thing. You got Hitler, who clearly went through a secret doctrine. And I'm sorry, my internet's a little unstable, but you got Dietrich Eckart, who was a handler of Hitler, whom he devoted the last chapter of the Mein Kampf to, whom he describes as being the person who brought him into his secret doctrine. You got Dietrich Eckart as well. I wrote a whole thing on this in my Occult Tesla series. I'm actually
Right. I remember that great series. Yeah. I'll put a link to that too.
And yeah, Dietrich Eckart also talks about how Hitler might be the one doing the action, but he's the one who has put this, who calls the tune. It's so crazy. I'll read it to you because it's so crazy. Yeah. Dietrich Eckart, member of the New Templars and the part of the German Armanan order and the Ariosophists, who are all tied to this. Again, it's catered to the German psyche, but it's still theosophical in its entire cosmology, as far as ascended masters, secret doctrines, a perennial religion to replace Christianity. Right. Eckart says in a Thule Gesellschaft meeting in December 1923, "Follow Hitler, he will dance, but it is I who have called the tune. I have initiated him into the secret doctrine, opened his centers in vision, and given him the means to communicate with the powers." It doesn't say what those powers are, but obviously, probably tied to Kutumi and all that crap. "Do not mourn for me." He knows he's going to die. So he says, "Do not mourn for me. I shall have influenced history more than any German." This is what Aleister Crowley is a member of the same German New Templar order. And this is the sort of thing that also is active in Japan, as Japan has been also turned into this weird mystical island empire religion under the British influence, going back to really the subversion of American influence of the Meiji Restoration. This is what is promised to be the New World Order, is Japan would have their jurisdiction as a fascist governing structure that would control China as a slave colony for the higher eugenics, Aryan-rooted Japanese, who somehow they catered a variation of the Blavatsky Aryan mythos to the Japanese, as if they were somehow Aryan, but that it encouraged some sort of a weird prejudicial elitism amongst the governing class that would then go full hog, carrying out brutal atrocities against the Koreans, against the Japanese. They killed millions, even of American POWs, that were then absorbed after World War II into the American Fort Detrick military-industrial complex, overseeing the bio-warfare complex. This is what Hiro Ishii and Unit 731, who carried out the war crimes of Japan, they were not punished. They were given jobs, as was the leading SS operatives were not punished at Nuremberg. They were simply repurposed by Allen Dulles and British intelligence to manage NATO's secret armies, and a lot of that went into South America, especially Argentina, where they regrouped and rebranded themselves under a variety of dictatorships in South America, like that of Pinochet's, but many others overseen by the CIA and the United Fruit that wanted
Noriega.
Absolutely. No, it really is the case that that history has really been. It's like I had a friend of mine who once corrected me when I use the often repeated adage that history repeats, and he just said, no, it's actually fools that repeat history. And I agree with that, because it reintroduces free will, because it's not like history is this power, this cyclical power the stars over our destinies. It's not that at all. It's that when we allow ourselves to become dumb and not study our past, sure, we will fall for the same formulas of folly and corruption that result always in the exact same very foreseeable outcome of wars, division within ourselves, outside of ourselves, collapses into dark ages if we do the civilizationally speaking. Always the same thing. Yeah. No, I think that if people use the method you just outlined right there, they'll be in a pretty good place to cut through a lot of the messy minefield of disinformation, or just there's this variability, this constant complexity that the oligarchy puts forth to trap people who are using a bad method of analysis that's very much based on what I guess could be considered simply a bottom-up method, trying to just peel back the layers of the onion. And it's like the more you peel, the more layers there are. It wears people down. It turns them into paranoid schizophrenics. It doesn't allow the mind to just have the meditative calmness to just take the time to understand what is the essential invariance. Like, what is it that doesn't change, that brings us into an idea of the nature of the thing called this oligarchical principle of that has been hanging on like a parasite for so many generations, millennia, and longer. And when you do it, it's like a cat will always be a cat. No matter what environment you put a cat in water or whatever, it'll be a cat. It'll desire cat things, but it has the nature of a cat, regardless of its there's a variety of cats, but it's something that distinguishes it, right? And it won't behave like an armadillo. But you want to have the idea of the nature of the thing, that you take time. It takes rigor, the improvement of memory power, which, like any muscle, can be made better or worse by using it or not, or misusing it. You break your muscles by misusing them, right? So there's a natural way of thinking which children do organically by just asking simple, humble questions that are over the top sometimes. But like, why are snowflakes, six-sided? Like, little kids they'll ask the stupid question because it's not a stupid question. They just really want to know the honest thing.
Exactly.
And they're only trained later on, if you got a bad education system, to stop asking questions, right? Like, either look for the right answer to get the right test, don't sound stupid.
Right.
And this gives people a false sense of arrogance when they start memorizing answers, but they didn't get the questions. They didn't get perplexed to know why they should want and thirst an answer to a problem that they didn't know exists. They just want to pass the test. At that point, that type of information is toxic because it might be practical on some level as a technician to apply a formula you memorized. But if you don't know why the formula was a needed solution concept to a problem that you never encountered, then you can't play with it. You can't make it better. You can't improve upon it. You're sort of like stuck in a fixed matrix, and you're not even aware. And more importantly, that arrogance of thinking you know things you didn't earn the knowledge of. You kind of got money without earning it. So now you don't even know what was the substance of the idea. You can then pass judgment on people who have different thoughts about the same thing that you think about, that disagree with you, but instead you can't debate them in a discussion of reason because
exactly
your solution. You can only denounce them, attack them, run away from the conversation, but you can't actually engage in human reason, which is the basis of the Republic. And that was the whole point, is that the Republic, when you look at the battles of the founding fathers of America, they understood much more than we do today that the Republic is great in principle, but unless, as Ben Franklin said to that woman in that apocryphal tale, that I create. What did you create us? What did you create? A republic. If you can keep it, it's a conditional that you have to have a culture that encourages the use of sovereign reason of the individual, that manifests in the form of education, media, entertainment, that is going to edify and empower our ability to use our conscience and our reason at the same time, with internal standards that are not gotten by experts from outside of us that induce us to bring those standards into ourselves. That doesn't work. You're going to create a society of slaves, or people who will fall for demagogues, who will just cater to their egos, utilizing the arts of rhetoric that flatter the mob. We'll leave them wanting more, I hope.
I hope so.
Yeah, no, I love this idea of getting back onto a few formal classes as well as slides like we've done in the past. I've always got good reception. So let's definitely do that for the next time we meet up.
Yeah.
Until then, people can go to matthew.arrett matthewarrett.substack.com is my Substack.
Okay, great.
And canadianpatriot.org, as well as risingtidefoundation.net. Those are the websites that Cynthia and I manage. And finally, if they would like the new book, I think it's useful to just get out of the comfort zone sometimes and revisit things after having voyaged in an uncharted domain. And I know for a lot of people, they get a little bit too comfortable in just analyzing geopolitics, domestic politics, and it doesn't change the quality of how we're appreciating the philosophical contours of the environment that we're moving through. And so I put together something called The Science Unshackled. It's a book called Restoring Causality in a World of Chaos.
Oh, I love it. Great.
It's sort of a sequel to The Clash of the Two Americas, and it's sort of the clash of the two sciences going back to the times of ancient Athens and Rome to the present. So that's something that's available on canadianpatriot.org, very easy to find. So I encourage people to jump into some science work and some philosophy and get back to me. Let me know your thoughts. I'm always curious to see how I could improve on trying to communicate these kinds of ideas.